Today at the National Press Club, Employment and Workplace Relations Minister Tony Burke. He's leading the government's proposed industrial relations changes, promising to close a loophole undercutting rates of pay. Tony Burke, today at the National Press Club.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. This time last year, the Albanese government was about to hold its Job Summit, an attempt to capture some cooperation and consensus across the spectrum of views and interests about how we could get wages moving and lift productivity. It was also pushing its first round of industrial relations reforms through federal parliament. Despite dire predictions of the consequences, the resulting introduction of multi-employer bargaining has recently taken place. When federal parliament resumes next week, our guest today will be proposing a second tranche of reforms. To unveil them today, please welcome Tony Burke to address us.
Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks to the National Press Club for having me here, and acknowledge the traditional owners and elders and ancestors, and very proud to be here as part of a government that is asking the Australian people to respond to an extraordinarily generous statement in the Uluru Statement from the Heart with the same level of generosity, with a yes vote only in a few weeks' time. I want to acknowledge my parliamentary colleague, Dave Smith, the Secretary of my department, Natalie James, and we have a number of representatives from both the trade union movement and from business organisations: Sally McManus and Michelle O'Neill, Innes Willocks, Andrew McKellar, Tanya Constable and Danita Warren, all people who've been involved at different levels in different ways in what has been a mammoth consultation task in getting the legislation together. Legislation which I'll be introducing after question time on Monday, and it will be called the Closing Loopholes Bill. Given that it's a press club, I thought it was reasonable here, of all the different venues, that I could read something from the press. So, there's an article that was published on the 23rd that I just want to draw to your attention. It'll sound familiar. Australia's largest employer organisations have threatened a fully funded anti-government campaign unless the Minister for Industrial Relations satisfactorily consults them on proposed changes to the Act. A meeting of the 5 big organisations in Melbourne unanimously resolved to fund a campaign unless they were satisfactorily consulted. They were already funding commitments to the campaign, and planning had begun. The meeting was convened by the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and was attended by the Business Council of Australia, the National Farmers Federation and other organisations. Legislation, and they went on to say, the legislation is an unfair and unbalanced document which ignores both employer interests and the fundamental issues of labour market reform. It's completely unacceptable to employers, and it does nothing to encourage investment or create jobs. It would in fact cost jobs and reduce investment. Even though we're at the press club, the person who wrote that article is not in the room today, and that's because it was Mike Taylor when he was the writer for the Canberra Times on the 23rd of September 1993. Not much has changed. But when he wrote that, let's also remember what was the big reform that had different groups so alarmed. It was enterprise bargaining. It was the exact reform that when we were dealing with multi-employer bargaining last year, we were told, but surely if you want good productivity outcomes, enterprise bargaining is where you should be looking. So there's a whole lot when you deal with reform where there are debates you are automatically in. And similar to during the election campaign, when the Prime Minister talked about the need to make sure in the annual wage review that wages didn't go backwards. We were told by our opponents at the time that that was reckless and dangerous. When Secure Jobs, Better Pay legislation was introduced to the Parliament last year, We were told it would lead to unemployment. We were told it would lead to strikes. We were told it would fail in getting wages moving. Well, on all of that, the results are now in. At the exact same time that inflation has been moderating, what's been happening in our workplaces? Wages have gone up. The wage price index at the moment at 3.6% has a 3 in front of it, something that didn't happen under the previous government, where low wage growth was a deliberate design feature of their management. In fact, not only did it not have a 3 in front of it, wage price index in the entire history of the index has only had 9 quarters where it's been below 2, and all of those have happened under coalition governments. In terms of the threats as to what all this would mean for jobs, we had, as a new incoming government, the best new jobs growth of any incoming government. We now have more than 500,000 jobs that have been created, but are they secure? 85% of the new jobs created are full-time. 85%. And you think of the 4 different categories that exist when you do the jobs data. Male full-time, male part-time, female full-time, female part-time. 55% of the jobs that have been created are women full-time. The legislation's making a difference. It's making a difference. But then what about the threats that if we put that legislation through, we would have coast-to-coast strikes? The last quarter of the previous government, how many days were lost to industrial action for the last quarter of the previous government? 128,000. So think about that, 128,000 days lost to industrial action. We've got the figures for the most recent quarter for this government. Not 128,000, 7,700 days lost to industrial action. The result of the legislation is exactly what we had argued it would be. And the result of this government's policies are exactly what we are intending them to be. We want people to be in work and we want those jobs to be secure. We want wages to be moving as inflation is coming down. And so the work that we've done on the annual wage review and the work that we did in the Secure Jobs Better Pay legislation affected every workplace in Australia, and affected in a variety of ways, because the other statistic that we don't want to let go of, because it didn't just deal with Secure Jobs Better Pay, it also dealt with gender equality. The gender pay gap is now the lowest it has ever been. So you look at all of that and say, well, does that mean the job's done? And the answer obviously is no. That's why we're here. Because while last year's legislation was about how do we reach into all the workplaces and provide outcomes for those who are under the award system, provide outcomes for those who are on the minimum wage, provide outcomes for those who are already bargaining, and provide outcomes for those who want to bargain but have had trouble getting into bargaining in the system, particularly in feminised industries. This year's legislation doesn't reach into every workplace. It deals with the loopholes that undercut wages and conditions and closes those loopholes. Most businesses don't use the loopholes. Most will be unaffected. Although for many businesses, they have competitors that are unreasonably undercutting them who do use these loopholes. There's a series of them in the bill that I introduce next week, but I want to deal with the 4 major ones today, and in particular on the 4th, provide a good level of detail that hasn't been provided until now. The first of the loopholes goes to wage theft. Now, take any shop, for example. The employer and the employee both have access to each other's money. The employee has access to the employer's money through the till. The employer has access to the worker's money through the wages. It is and should be a criminal offence for the worker to be taking money from the till. But it is not a criminal offence in most of Australia for the employer to be taking money from the wages. That loophole needs to be closed down. Most underpayments are not wage theft. Most underpayments are a mistake. Sometimes there can be issues of recklessness and things like that, but often there's just an honest mistake that's been made. And we don't want to catch any of that with the criminal law. But where someone has that same intention that the worker would have when they take money from the till. The criminal law needs to be available there as well, and we'll close that loophole in the legislation that I introduce on Monday. The second one, and I've gone through this in some detail already through a speech I gave at the Sydney Institute, is when someone is forced to be a permanent casual. Now, the concepts of permanent casual are logically either or. You either have a permanent job as a part-timer or full-timer, or you're a casual. And yet increasingly there are many people where the hours that they are working are indistinguishable from the hours that would be rostered for a part-timer or full-time worker. And yet they have difficulty transferring across. Under common law, the situation, and the previous government legislated around this, it was the case where common law had a definition and said, well, if you're incorrectly classified, back pay would have to be paid as well. That always carried the risk of back pay in those situations of discouraging someone from wanting to convert, because they would have a long period of time where they could be accumulating both leave and loading. So the legislation that we'll deal with will increase the rights for people to make that conversion. It'll increase their capacity so they can do so after 6 months. They won't be able to keep asking every week or anything like that. It'll be every 6 months they can ask again. And the existing system that the government put in place where the employer makes an offer after 12 months will remain. Most casuals won't take this up, particularly casuals who are students, who are not the person responsible for paying for the main household expenses, things like that. But there will be people who want to be able to convert who currently are having trouble doing so. There's a minority of employers that, as a management tool, like to avoid giving people security. It's a minority, it's not many. But for those people, this change will be life-changing. They'll be working the same hours they were already working, but they'll be doing them with leave entitlements. They'll be doing them knowing that they have a secure job. The third of the loopholes is what we refer to as the labour hire loophole. Now, this arises in industries where you have an enterprise agreement. So if you don't have an enterprise agreement, this is irrelevant for you. But if you have an enterprise agreement in place, the labour hire loophole is where the employer has agreed for particular tasks, for particular classifications, that there'll be a particular rate of pay. And then having agreed to it, having had it registered, says, oh, but I'm now going to use someone who's technically a different employer, and all those rules instantly disappear. And we can now go right back down to the award again. Now, that's a loophole. It's not what's intended. It's currently legal for the companies that are doing it. It's frustrating, unreasonable competition for someone who's got a similar enterprise agreement and is not undercutting it in that way. But effectively, all we're saying here is the rates that should be paid are the rates that have been agreed to. It's as simple as that. And that loophole is something that will be closed in this legislation. It's not to get rid of labour hire. There are lots of appropriate uses for labour hire. At different times that I've been an employer over the years, I've used labour hire. The labour hire workers traditionally, particularly at one point when I was employing people running a bar in Lakemba, was that the temps you'd get in, because we didn't have enough people if we had a big function, were all paid more. That's how labour hire normally works, and that's fine. But if you have an enterprise agreement and you've agreed to certain minimum rates of pay, labour hire shouldn't be used as a device to undercut what's been registered and agreed to. The fourth loophole, and it's the one I want to spend most of the detail on today, is what's happened with the gig economy. And to explain this, I'll start with this principle. The gig economy and the platforms that are involved are proud of their role of being disruptors. And in their role as being disruptors, they have ended up with products that most of us have on our phones, that most of us like the convenience of, and that a whole lot of people working in the sector like the flexibility that goes with it. So while there's been some campaigns and some concern, is the government going to try to turn everyone into an employee? The answer is no. We accept the technology. We accept the method of engagement. But we can't have a situation where we have this growing section of the workforce where they, at the moment, have no minimum standards. The reason they have no minimum standards is this. At the moment, you turn up to the Fair Work Commission and the Fair Work Commission asks the initial question, are you an employee? If you are an employee, you have a whole series of rights. If you're not an employee, all of those rights, all of them fall off a cliff. What we want to do is turn that cliff into a ramp. And so for people in the gig economy, have a situation where you don't get all the rights that you would have as an employee, but you do have some minimum standards. I'll never forget during the election debates, there was the one, I think it was the one in Perth with Mark Riley chairing it, where each of the Prime Minister, or the Prime Minister of the day and the Leader of the Opposition of the day got to ask each other a question as part of the debate. And Anthony Albanese, as Leader of the Opposition, his question to Scott Morrison as Prime Minister was to say, should every Australian worker be paid at least the minimum wage? And under current law, the Prime Minister of the day couldn't guarantee that. Because we've got people doing jobs that we all used to envisage were the sorts of jobs where you've had minimum standards. And because they technically fall outside the definition of an employee, they've got none. So along this ramp, at the top of the ramp, you've got the rights for employees. Halfway along, gig workers who are employee-like, and down the bottom of the ramp, independent contractors. And I want to talk about each of those three levels. So right at the top of the ramp, most people won't be aware, but effectively, there's no definition of what it is to be an employee in the Fair Work Act. And so without that definition being there in any serious detail, what has happened is the courts have gone through a case called JAMSEC to a principle that basically says, if the contract says you're not an employee, then you're not an employee. Even if every feature that we look at, we say objectively we are talking about an employee here, if the contract says you're not, then effectively you're not. That's not a common sense way of making sure we've got standards here in Australia. So we'll be putting a definition in of what it is to be an employee, which will go back more effectively to what the common law definition had been thought to be before that case. Having established what it is to be an employee, that allows us to have the definition further down the ramp for workers in the gig economy for what it is to be employee-like. Now, some good points were made, including from some of the people in this room, about some of the people who we wanted to make sure were not included in this and not regulated in this. Certainly examples were put forward of people who get work just through Facebook groups or on WhatsApp groups. That sort of thing, even though it's digital, is that really gig economy? No, that wasn't what we were trying to capture. Other people have raised examples of on building sites. Do we want suddenly tradies because they're doing work through Airtasker to find themselves regulated in this way? And no, we don't want that. So the way we've drafted the legislation is to establish two initial questions, and unless you answer yes to both, this whole section is irrelevant. First question, are you on a digital platform? Second question, are you employee-like? And if the answer is yes to both, then there's a new jurisdiction for the Fair Work Commission. So what is it to be employee-like? There's effectively three things that the Fair Work Commission will look at. Do you have low bargaining power? Do you have low levels of control over the work that you do? And finally, are you being paid low wages in the sense that less than what you would get if you were being employed as an employee? With those three tests and the digital concept, you put that together and people say, okay, well, roughly, while it's a decision for the Commission, realistically, who's in and who's out? Realistically, the food delivery apps that you use would be covered and the workers there would be covered. The rideshare apps that you use would be covered. And the apps that are used in the care economy would be covered because they all meet that employee-like test, and obviously they're all digital platforms. But people getting work through a Facebook or a WhatsApp group would not be covered. People getting work in the way, certainly at the moment that I've seen Airtasker work, I haven't seen anyone using Airtasker who you could possibly satisfy that definition of being employee-like. And so they would not be covered, because effectively Airtasker runs like a digital version of the Trading Post. That's effectively how it runs. So the next question, and I'm very grateful to the platform, some of whom are represented in the room today, for the consultation that we've had, because part of what they've put to us is said, okay, it's one thing to get that gateway right, but once you've got the gateway, you need to make sure that the rules that the Fair Work Commission brings in place don't effectively turn someone into an employee, even though you've said you want to accept the form of engagement. How does that work? Well, think of it in these terms. If the Fair Work Commission, as I reasonably expect it would, came up with a minimum rate of pay for people on various platforms, it probably wouldn't define that as an hourly rate. It may go for a 5-minute or per minute rate or something like that. Why? Because if you had a minimum hourly rate, you would fundamentally change the form of engagement on a large number of platforms. So realistically, you'd find the Commission making those decisions on much smaller time periods as to how they worked out what those minimum rates were. But if the Fair Work Commission were to introduce rostering rights, at that moment you have killed the form of engagement for people who work in the gig economy. Because the moment they're committed to a roster, the whole nature of their engagement would fall over. So rostering rights wouldn't be possible. Similarly, you've only got to wander past any of the delivery riders who are outside any of your takeaway places in your main streets, or if you're taking a rideshare arrangement yourself, you'll often see the case that someone's got multiple apps running. So you couldn't logically pay somebody for the time that they're just on an app, because that would wreck the form of engagement. So you couldn't do that. But things like minimum rates of pay, things like terms of payment, time periods, how quickly you have to be paid after a shift, those sorts of principles would all be able to find their way through decisions of the Fair Work Commission into being minimum standards. This is a game changer for what it is to work in the gig economy, because it means you keep all the flexibility that you know. All that flexibility is there. Hop onto the app when you want, take shifts when you want. The apps will still have different surge mechanisms where at different points of day where there's higher demand, your rates go up. That'll all still be possible. But we'll no longer have a situation where there is no floor. We'll no longer have a situation where some of the more reputable apps are being undercut by other apps that emerge on the market that are putting people into unreasonably poor remuneration and unreasonably unsafe working conditions. So those changes create the situation for those workers where they go from effectively no guaranteed rights at all to having some. And I know technically at the moment, all of these people who work on the apps are technically small businesses. But let's be realistic here. I know what a small business is. I grew up in a small business family. I've run my own small business over the years. Someone delivering pizzas on the back of a bike is not running a small business. They are a worker with very few rights, and depending on their app, they'll get different levels of treatment. We want them to have some minimum standards. Because while we all love the technology, it's got to be possible to have 21st century technology without having 19th century working conditions. That has to be something that we can manage as a country. The next right that'll be available for gig workers, and I hate the term, and I'm now going to say it out loud on television, so that's just life. I remember the first time I dealt with unfair dismissal jurisdictions, and people often use the word termination, and the word, as language, it's pretty dramatic language. They've managed to go one up in the gig economy, and they call it deactivation. But it's effectively what happens if you're dismissed from a platform. There can be cases here, like with any dismissal, that are completely reasonable, and there can be cases that are unreasonable. But at the moment, you don't have a guarantee of any disputes resolution mechanism for people in those circumstances. And so there will be a jurisdiction within the Fair Work Commission for people to be able to effectively make a claim for unfair deactivation if they're bounced off one of the platforms and they believe that there's no merit to that decision. So that takes us halfway down the ramp. So not as many rights as an employee, but certainly more than zero, which is where people are at the moment, and the full flexibility of the technology and the convenience of the technology remains. Down the bottom, independent contractors. There's a small jurisdiction that will be established in the legislation when I introduce it next week for the Fair Work Commission. In my first term here, John Howard was in his last term as Prime Minister. And as part of the industrial relations changes, so we all remember work choices, but there was also, they talked a lot about the Independent Contractors Act, that they were going to create rights for independent contractors and this would be a game changer. In the life of that legislation, so it's about 17 years since it was brought in now, it's been used 68 times. And only 3 occasions in all of that time where a court has made a ruling under the Independent Contractors Act. And there's a reason for this. It's not that it created rights that no one wanted. It's that to be able to use the Independent Contractors Act, you have to be able to lawyer up and turn up with a legal team to the Federal Court of Australia. And most independent contractors are not in a position to be able to do that. So we don't want to have a case where everything would come into the Fair Work Commission. So what we will do by regulation is set a threshold, and below that threshold, the Fair Work Commission will be able to deal with cases as a no-cost jurisdiction, effectively, where you don't have to lawyer up to be able to exercise your rights. Above the threshold, it'll still be under as the Independent Contractors Act as it currently operates. This will give independent contractors, for the first time, an affordable way of being able to enforce their rights. But the description of those rights won't change from what was introduced by John Howard when they introduced the Independent Contractors Act. It'll simply be, there'll now be an affordable jurisdiction. I don't know how many people will use it. I reckon it'll be more than 3 over the course of 17 years. And that's the ramp. The higher you are at the ramp, at the highest point is to be an employee. At the lowest point is to be an independent contractor. The employee gets the most rights. The independent contractor gets a right against unfair contracts, but that's it. And halfway along, for gig workers, we establish a set of minimum standards for them. Now, all of that will be in what I introduce on Monday, and I don't pretend for a minute that that will necessarily change the dynamic of the public debate. It will still be the case that in the public debate, some things, no matter what's in the legislation, will continue to be argued are somehow at risk, and we'll have that debate and it'll bounce back and forth. There will still be some articles unattributed, which I don't think anyone spotted the irony of this, but there were articles last week of an unattributed person complaining that they wanted all the consultation to be on the record and to be made publicly. But those sorts of comments all happen, and people will give whatever off-the-record information they want to be able to give. And there'll be an advertising campaign, as there was in 1993, as there was earlier this year. And that's all fine. Different organisations will represent their members. But there are 3 arguments that are always put when people don't want to argue the merits of an issue. They will ask for delay, they will complain about consultation, and they will talk about something that the issue is not. And my simple request in the debate is for anyone who does want to stop us closing the loopholes, defend them. Because so far no one has defended any of the loopholes I've described. If someone thinks it is reasonable that wage theft not be a crime, argue it. If someone thinks it is reasonable that someone who can easily be converted to secure work isn't given it, argue it. If someone believes that gig workers should have a complete race to the bottom and no rights, then argue that. And if someone believes that the labour hire loophole is fair and having agreed to an enterprise agreement rate, you shouldn't have to have that as the minimum standard for people who are working and embedded within your crews, then argue it. And let's have a serious policy debate. Because the serious policy debate is important, and what's happened behind closed doors, I have to say, has been really high quality discussion, and the legislation is different as a result. None of this, of course, will affect what happens in the debate between myself and my counterparts, where the other side of politics are already warming up to be able to say this one is even worse than what Labor did last year. I'm not quite sure how Senator Cash and Peter Dutton will argue that it's worse, given that last year's bill was going to close down Australia. I'm not sure how you build a crescendo from there. But if anyone can, I reckon Peter Dutton and Michaelia Cash will make a good fist of it, and they'll be able to get there. But all of that drama will be around us, and ultimately at one level, none of that will matter either. What will matter is, how does this legislation change people's lives? Because for the person working in a convenience store who was worried about whether they might be breaking their visa or what the laws might be for them, they had no protection that the employer was stealing their money and yet not committing a criminal offence. They'll now have the protection of the criminal law. The casual worker who is supporting people, who hasn't had a holiday for years and years and years, will have some rights to be able to convert to more secure work, and that'll be life-changing. The gig worker, the labour hire worker, like the guy I met in the Hunter who took me in his truck, called truck, it was like an apartment block that he drove me in, and the whole thing shuttered as the coal load landed behind us, who just said, I've never worked in another industry where casuals are paid less than permanent workers per hour. How do you do that with a loading? Because the labour hire loophole radically cut the base for the casuals who are being employed through a different method. And for the gig worker, who we've all seen, who is currently out there running red lights, going up onto the footpath, down onto the road, on the road creating an extra lane between the parked cars and the traffic, knowing that at any moment, if a car door opens, instead of riding between the lanes, they'll be lying beneath the traffic. They'll have some minimum standards. They'll have some minimum standards. Closing these loopholes will change their lives. And that's the debate that starts on Monday.
Thanks, Minister. You've mentioned that this will be the first time we've had a definition of what an employee is. Could I ask, what will that definition be? And given that we haven't had that, are there likely to be sort of flow-on consequences or sort of reverse engineering of existing legislation outside this area of focus at the moment?
Effectively, the new definition of an employee will be a legislated version of the old definition of an employee. So before JAMSTAC, the common law effectively looked at all the elements of the relationship to work out whether there realistically was an employment relationship going on. I call that sort of test a what's really going on test. It's a very practical sort of definition. I get why business prefers the simplicity of, if it's in the contract, that's the end of the matter. Like, I respect the simplicity of that. But we can't have a situation where you can put something in a contract that is objectively not what's going on and have it prevail. So the extent to which it will be gamed will really be only the extent to which the old common law could have been gamed. It's that test, the employment one, will be very familiar to all the industrial relations practitioners in the way it's drafted.
Phil Curry has a question.
Hi, Mr. Burke. Phil Curry from the AFR. Just something that's a lot of claims and counterclaims, obviously, in the lead up to the release of the legislation, and being in the Fourth Estate, we've actually not been privy to any of the details or the discussions, but something that's come from the mining sector a couple of weeks ago under labour hire or same job, same pay was the issue of service contractors. So an example, if a mining company brings in service contractors to maintain a big bit of equipment or do catering or something like that, and the mining company itself doesn't have its own people doing that job, will those people have to be paid at a different rate, or will they be engaged under the rate their own employer has them at?
Yeah. Thanks for that. And I'm not announcing all the bits all at once.
Sure.
So there's a bit more to come. But if I can put it in these terms, the relationship with ARIA was not good last year in terms of the engagement. It was sort of all done through newspapers and the media. This time ARIA came to me with their members and I sat in the little room around the corner from my office in Parliament House with a whole range of service contractors who were everything from heavy equipment to repairs to catering. And the case they made was compelling. Some of them acknowledged that part of their business is labour hire and completely accepted that that part of their business would be caught by what we were doing, but made a very good case that there is a good level of work that is done on site that where the service provided is not labour. The service provided is far more specialist than that, and what I introduce will be drafted to take very full account of the points that they raise with me.
So they'll be exempt? Huh. Yes.
David Crowe.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Mr Burke. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age of Melbourne. There are many different aspects to the bill that you'll put next week, but one of them is about casuals. You mentioned the changes that you've got in mind there. There are 2.7 million casuals in Australia, so there are a lot of people in the community with a great interest in the changes that you're going to make. Not all of them would want to be permanent workers, but some would. You mentioned back pay, and I just want you to clarify the situation there, because there was a warning from your department several years ago that the cost to employers if this led to back pay claims would be $18 to $39 billion. So there's a lot riding on this. Are you closing off any option for those casuals who become permanent to seek back pay? Is that an absolute guarantee that there won't be back pay claims?
So the way we've drafted it is whatever could be owed is offset by the loading that's been paid. So if you had some weird occasion where the casual loading that was being paid was something like 5%, well, you'd offset it to 5%. But in most situations, the casual loading's at 25%, which would fully offset leave entitlements. So effectively, you have a situation where you end up with a worker at any point in time either getting leave or getting loading.
So they could then claim some of what they believe they'd be owed from the past.
Well, no, you're talking about a situation. I have invented an example of if the casual, because I'm trying to make sure we don't create a new loophole, where an employer, for example, could put through a new agreement with a really low casual loading that did not, in fact, offset the leave entitlements. So similar to what the previous government put in place, we're not interfering with that concept at all. So the concept of there being some big liability coming to business, no, we've ruled it out.
Okay, thanks.
Rhiannon Down.
Hello, Rhiannon Down from The Australian. Thank you for your speech. Business groups have scheduled a press conference directly after your speech. It's likely they will say the changes will increase complexity, cost jobs, and that the first and second waves are all one way of benefiting workers and unions. But how do these changes actually benefit employers rather than just deliver on a union wish list? And can you guarantee these reforms, especially the gig economy, won't just jack up the prices for consumers?
Okay, there's a lot in that, so let me work through it. First of all, what you say about increased complexity, I don't want to disregard that. It's true. Having no standards at all is really simple. Having no protections is completely simple. You don't need to put anything in the Act to provide the levels of protection that we currently have for gig workers. So yeah, it adds something, and it needs to. If we're going to be a nation where you don't have to rely on tips to make ends meet, then there needs to be some extra regulation and words on the page, and that has to be done. Businesses put to us, well, there'd be some aspects and ways we could regulate that would create a real problem in complexity for them. So we've evaded that, and I went through in the speech the different ways we've made sure that you can't have a minimum standard that would change the form of engagement, that full level of flexibility is there. And once again, when you say, oh, could there be a pass-through to somebody getting the pizza delivered to their home? Well, yeah, underpaying people is cheaper. Yeah, it is. Slavery is probably cheaper too. Yeah, there is some modest pass-through here. We are talking about some of the lowest paid people in Australia. And if that means there's a tiny bit extra that you pay when your pizza arrives to your door and they're more likely to be safe on the roads getting there, then I reckon that's a pretty small price to pay.
David Spears.
Minister, thank you. David Spears from the ABC. Just to pick up on what you said there, a tiny bit extra to get your pizza delivered. You also said, though, this will be a game changer for that rider delivering the pizza. They won't have to, weave through the parked cars and end up on the road. Is a tiny bit extra really going to achieve that game change that you're talking about? And what can we expect in terms of the change for that delivery rider?
Well, effectively, if you work on, and it's inappropriate for me to give you a figure here, simply because it's the Fair Work Commission that would be doing it, and for ministerial direction on that it'd be really inappropriate. But can I also put it in these terms? The cooperation from the platforms and the goodwill that has been there from all the food delivery platforms as we've worked through these principles would not be there if there were going to be a really significant cost impost on people. Like, it just wouldn't be there. Some of the issues that go to people racing go to rates of pay. Some of them go to risk of unfair deplatforming or deactivation. And, for example, people worried that unless they get there at lightning speed that they'll lose they won't get the next shift. That the speed being taken into account, the algorithm, those sorts of arguments. But the delivery that you get to your door is not the only delivery that person is making in the course of an hour. So the fact that the cost might be modest for yourself doesn't mean it doesn't all add up in a significant way for that worker. And effectively, if I go back to years ago, I remember pizzas when the delivery service used to be Pizza Hut, and everyone doing it was an employee. They were all employees, they all had rights. We always accepted that this sort of work would be work that had minimum standards attached. And in the last decade, that's gone. We're simply wanting to bring back what those appropriate minimum standards should be, for the Commission to be able to work it out. If it created a price problem for consumers, you wouldn't find the cooperation that we've had from the platforms. But it is a real change. And don't just think, when you think of the people delivering your pizza, for example, if it's coming through Uber Eats, don't forget the disproportionate, for the size of the business, number of injuries that we saw with businesses like Hungry Panda. Like, there's some small apps out there that have been radically undercutting, that have been a real safety concern. I've met with those workers. Over the years, I've been to memorials with them. Yeah, that's why I say it's a game changer.
If I could just intervene on that question of the gig economy. Everybody's focusing on the delivery drivers, but a huge part of the gig economy, as you mentioned, is care economy workers now. It's hundreds of thousands of people who are going onto platforms to get work in the NDIS and the like. Are you sure that you are doing enough with these reforms to stop this trend to people being, going, what's the opposite of being deplatformed, but being platformed and becoming employee-like rather than employees?
Okay, so if I can explain what one of those platforms does. A lot of people, if you're not involved in the aged care sector or the NDIS directly, you won't realise how much of this is now being delivered through the gig economy. First thing to remember with this is, as taxpayers, we all pay for the service to be delivered at the rate of pay that would apply for an employee. So as taxpayers, we've already made that commitment for that money to be spent. What happens is it then goes to the platform, takes a percentage from the user and a percentage from the worker, and workers bid down against each other for who's willing to get the work. Now, one of those platforms, for example, will say, oh, but we have a minimum rate. Their minimum rate's not based on the award. Their minimum rate is not based on an award that would have a minimum hourly shift, a minimum shift attached to it. Their minimum rate is based on the minimum wage, not for an occupation that in fact has an award that is relevant. So even on the platform itself, where they say, oh, we do a minimum rate and we do a loading and we do money for superannuation, it's still less than what you're legally meant to pay someone. And they get away with it because of a loophole And as taxpayers, we still fork out the full amount. That's not sustainable. And so the flexibility will work for a whole lot of people, and you can still have the flexibility. But our objective is to fund services for people with disabilities and to fund services for people who are aged. That's the objective. It's not to make money for a platform that is underpaying workers. And so the platform, I'm sure, will be up in arms about these changes, and that's fine. They can have their argument, but I just suggest to them, don't pretend that this means fewer services get provided to the person needing them, because that's not true, because the government's already fully paying for it. Be honest and defend the loophole. Be honest and defend that somehow there's a business out there that thinks it has a right to take taxpayers' money, clip the ticket, and underpay workers at the other end. And if they're willing to have that argument, I'll turn up too.
Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson, SBS News. Minister, a substantial portion of the workers in the industries that you've been talking about do come from migrant backgrounds and new arrivals. So what do you see as your IR obligations to protect new arrivals from exploitation, injury or death at work? And do you see any merit in, for some industries at least, the idea of default union membership as an extra form of protection?
Default union membership's not something that we're going to. That's not there. I hear the policy arguments about it, but it's not something the government's proposing in any way. The issue with respect to that you start with, though, Anna, is sadly true. People who are exploited are disproportionately here in Australia as our guests, and it's an issue that I've been grappling with both here, dealing with employment law, and similarly with the obligations I've got as Employment Minister, dealing with the PALM scheme as well, trying to make sure that people are not underpaid. So there is a particular obligation that that Anna Booth will take on in her Ombudsman role, and there'll be work that's happening there. There's legislation we have before the Parliament at the moment, improving the rights for workers who are on visas, but this is going to be a continued job lot. There is a cruel, deliberate and menacing project out there from some to exploit people on the basis that you can't just threaten to fire them, you can threaten to deport them. And it will take some time for us to get on top of that, but this legislation is part of that project.
Thank you.
Poppy Johnson.
Thanks for your speech, Minister. There's been some concern from industry about these reforms, but you say you've responded to flexibility issues and the like. Do you expect any digital platforms to leave the Australian market in response to these changes?
No, I don't. No, I don't. And the only reason one would be if they were really determined to exploit people. And that's not the sort of business I'd welcome anyway.
Melissa Code.
Hi, Minister. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. You mentioned the sort of efficacy of the ICA legislation over 17 years and also the three perils of, I guess, pragmatic politics where people delay, complain about consultation and argue about issues that they're not. So my question is about if you want to make sure that the legislation is closing loopholes, is there any sort of directive you've given to your public servants about evaluating whether those reforms are in place? What does that look like? How are you going to be looking at this no-fee jurisdiction and whether it's getting the uptake you like?
Thanks. And first of all, I'll take the opportunity just to thank my department again. It has been a mountain of work and a mountain of engagement. And for all the engagement that I've had personally with the different employer organisations, you can multiply that many times in terms of what the department have put together. And so I really want to give full respect to their work on this. And I I keep checking in terms of trying to make sure that people are working respectable hours, but I certainly know some people have been putting in hours beyond what I would hope would be part of a workplace. So I want to pay respect to the members of the department. The challenge is you need to get your data in two different ways. You need to get your data in terms of what's happening with the cases, but then you also need to be doing your general surveys for what's happening out there, because the cases will only be what happened when something was challenged, not what happened. So, for example, we don't have cases at the moment about family and domestic violence leave clogging up the system, but I know anecdotally it's being used, and it's creating a circumstance where a whole lot of women in particular are not having to choose between safety and pay. But if we only went to court decisions, we wouldn't get that sort of information. So it'll be a combination of the department keeping a line of sight on what's happening in first the Commission and then ultimately the courts on appeal, but secondly making sure both generally and specifically through Jobs and Skills Australia that we are continually capturing the data to be able to establish the extent to which we are improving job security for people in Australia. There will always be people who want some insecure jobs. They'll always be there, and that's fine. They won't have a trouble finding them. But I'm very conscious. Your rent's not casual. Your bills aren't casual. Feeding your kids isn't casual. None of your liabilities are casual. And if you're in a circumstance where you've got all of those liabilities heading your way, it's not unreasonable that you'll want your job to be secure as well. And finding out how that's happening across the economy is something that Jobs and Skills Australia, I'm hoping, will help me with.
Thanks. Paul Karp.
Thanks very much, Minister. Paul Karp from The Guardian. You've been quite clear in your speech that you think that Airtasker, these new laws won't apply to that platform. How did you distinguish that platform which says that it just matches independent contractors with consumers of a service with something like Mabel, a care economy platform who would say it's doing the same thing? And relatedly, given that the legislation gives the Minister the power to prescribe the characteristics of an employee-like worker by regulation, do you have an extraordinary discretion to get platforms that you don't like and put them within scope?
The latter is simply if you end up with a decision that is wildly off what anyone was expecting, to be able to have a way of dealing with that, because we're dealing with something new. Like the cliff that I referred to has been within our workplace relations system in Australia right back to the days of the Harvester judgment. Like this concept of an employment cliff has been there, and the concept of businesses being treated separately has always been there. The concept now of saying, well, there are some people where they're being classified as businesses but they need some protection. This is a new jurisdiction for the Fair Work Commission that we're dealing with. Now, I can't give a short answer to the first question, so I may talk a little bit faster to try to get through it. Because what you've described there, Paul, is something that we weighed up. And this is it's described as vertical versus horizontal. But effectively, one way of doing the test of this new jurisdiction was to say whether the platform sets the rate or whether the worker sets the rate. And could that be the way that you define who was in and who was out? Here's the problem had we gone down that pathway. If you look at the airports at the moment, there's big signs up for a business called InDrive, and they say, you set the price. Now, this is a driving app that'll be a direct competitor with the other driving apps, which is using the exact method you just described of the matching Airtasker Mabel style matching. If we set minimum standards and didn't capture apps like that, effectively, all the ones that most people will have on their phones at the moment, Uber and the like, they'd have minimum standards, and they'd be facing a competitor for the exact same customers that was able to undercut because they'd found a different way of doing the algorithm. What would happen at that moment? There would be economic pressure on all of those platforms to make the same jump and evade. That's what would happen. The idea of this reform is effectively to give the Fair Work Commission the same level of flexibility that the platforms have. Because around the world, if you give too rigid a system and you give this high definition, this is how you're in, this is how you're out, platforms have then said, this is a how-to guide to evade it. One of them evades it, and that then creates commercial pressure for all of them too. We would have replaced one loophole with another. I don't want to do that. So that's why we said, okay, instead of should the test be who sets the price, the test should be what do the workers look like? And if the worker is, I gave those 3 examples all dealing with the word low bargaining power, low control, low pay. If you look at those features, that tells you who's going to be employee-like. And once you look at it that way, businesses like Mabel come in, businesses like Airtasker fall out.
Jack Quayle.
Thank you very much for your speech, Mr. Burke. It's Jack Quayle from NCA Newswire. Just on your point about those minimum standards, so under Mabel's system, that they would be covered by the minimum standards, but you might have a worker that's doing the exact same work on somewhere like Airtasker, then that doesn't have those minimum standards. I mean, how does that work? I mean, you've said that wouldn't create another loophole, but effectively there are these 2 different operating environments where one has minimum standards but one doesn't. I mean, how does that work?
We're describing in terms of the platforms, but the Commission will be able to deal with the type of work. So it is not inconceivable, for example, for a whole lot of people who are employee-like to start using a platform where the main business of that platform would never be caught, and for there end up being minimum standards for those workers on that platform. That's not impossible, and it needs to be that way. Otherwise, you'd end up with circumstances where, once again, there's a how-to guide on how to evade. So the Commission would have the full flexibility to be able to work out how things are extended in that way.
So does that mean Facebook Marketplace, because you've got people in the care economy there?
They're
all going to be dragged into this too?
No. There's 7 or 8 ifs there, and we're talking about a jurisdiction that hasn't even heard the Mabel case yet.
Okay.
So let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Kimberly Keynes.
Kimberly Keynes from the West Australian. Thank you, Minister, for your speech. Just following on from your response to Phil Curry's question, how many mining and services companies have told you they'll have to restructure their operations because of the new labour hire rules? And is your government preventing the critical minerals boom from happening in WA with these rules?
The answer is none and no. And for the very simple reason, the service contractors have come to me saying that they've come with a solution, to their absolute credit. They haven't come to me saying, this is a disaster and we need to stop you from doing anything. They've actually come and said, look, part of what we do is labour hire. That's going to be caught. We're okay with that. But there's these other things that we do, which we don't think you're intending to catch, and a proposal in terms which has been written about, a multi-factor test, to say how they think we might go about making sure that we only affect those parts of their business and they're right, that we're actually trying to be able to reach. So as long as we get that right, and we've been following their advice on how we draft this, there is no restructure required from them. The restructure was required in terms of how we drafted the Act.
Thank you.
Andrew Tillett.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Minister. Just going back to Phil's question about, and the answer you said about exemptions for service contractors.
You all want to get a few days ahead of this announcement.
Well, I was going to ask you about the Bulldogs, but I think we're going through enough at the moment, supporters. Anyway, but this exemption for service contractors, we understand that we're hearing, though, that they can only be exempt if they put themselves through a sort of a 12-factor test and effectively litigate themselves out of the same job, same pay laws system. What do you say to that?
You're being told wrong.
Thank you.
Could I just... Phil Curry's going to ask another question, but before he does, I'm just still a little bit unclear on what the minimum standards will be, in the sense that you were talking, for example, about delivery drivers getting injured in the traffic, a care worker getting injured looking after somebody, lifting them or whatever. You're not talking about workplace safety rules here, are you? Or, I mean, what are the actual minimum standards going to be?
The workplace safety is already managed by the states. So in terms of jurisdiction, the states already regulate workplace safety. There is, for riders, for example, an additional safety issue that if you are paid such low rates that you have to absolutely rush to be able to get any sort of meaningful income, that, regardless of safety rules, creates an additional risk on the road. So that's the only real relevance to safety. The issues that the Fair Work Commission will be empowered to do is effectively to deal with establishing minimum standards that don't break the form of engagement. And that's effectively the remit. There'll be some things in the Act that we make clear you can definitely do this. There'll be other things where we say you definitely can't do this. But most of it is governed by the simple test. If the minimum standard you were wanting to apply would change the form of engagement, then there is no jurisdiction to do it. If it simply provides minimum standards within the form of engagement, and like rates of pay, for example, can do that, then for the first time the Fair Work Commission would be able to put that in place.
Thank you. Phil Curry.
Thanks again. Just back to the gig economy, and you said the consumers should expect to pay a little bit more just to guarantee the fair treatment of the workers. You've talked about minimum standards. I think on radio this morning you ruled out overtime, but what about penalty rates? Is that going to factor into the minimum standards for Uber drivers and delivery workers?
Oh, look, it's not something that's specifically referred to in the ledge. It's something that the Commission would be able to make a decision on. They'd hear evidence each way. Like some people would argue for particular times of day. Like the reality is, at particular times of day, those rates already go up. That's sort of inbuilt into the algorithm a bit as well. So I don't know the extent to which the case would be taken up, but there's neither a requirement nor a prohibition on that.
Thanks.
Well, we're looking towards an interesting few weeks of debate, I'm sure. Please thank Tony Burke for speaking to us.